Right, so hello everyone. The title that Richard suggested for this talk was Alternative Media for Journalism with Integrity. And I had to think quite a while about what this actually meant for me and for my organization and otherwise. And it kind of put me through the journey that I've been through the past 25 years, my journey into becoming an academic and now becoming a journalist, and what this has all meant for me. And it has actually led me to, as academics do when we're trying to process trauma, a new theoretical framework for journalism. Because of course, I'm an academic, so I have to do a paradigm shift, or at least say that I'm going to do one. So I want to take you through a story of kind of where I started in my PhD and where I am now, and kind of what I think this means now for what it means to be seeking the truth in today's really complex environment. So when I did my PhD, I studied photojournalism professionals, and I was under the illusion that they really cared about how they searched for and described photos in the archives where they stored their photographs, which at that time we were moving into a digital environment where we had digital photography and photo libraries were no longer in print. And one of the photographers that I spoke with was David Leeson, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, mostly known for covering the invasion of Iraq by the United States and other allies, including this country, back in 2003. And one of the things that he talked about was how the photos that he was providing and sending back to the newspaper were actually lying to the public about what was happening. And this was one of the photos that was well known because you can see the red dust in the background of part of the invasion that was supplied to the newspaper, to the Dallas Morning News, where I was doing a lot of my research. So I was in his house when I was interviewing him. We talked to him for hours. And he had a Pepsi bottle with Arabic written on it because it was from Iraq. And I was like, oh, they drink Pepsi, really? In Iraq, I had no idea. So he had some of this dust that you see in the photo, and he poured it into my hand from the bottle. And he said, rub it on your hands. And I went like this, and it was brown. And he said, I was covered in that for 3 weeks. I know the color of this really well. It was actually brown. It wasn't orange. It wasn't red. The reason that it was made that color was because the photo editors changed the color to make it more impactful for the public to sell more papers. And even though he was well known for this photo, he was really upset about the fact that he had changed this. And so when I think back to that story, I think about it frequently when I think about, when I was doing my research and what this meant for basically one of the findings of my PhD dissertation was that photos are used to lie to the public in the media. And so now 20 years later, somehow I'm working for UK Column. So it's all about karma, isn't it? So, here's another photo from his colleague, Cheryl Diaz-Meyer, who was also in Iraq. And here you can see this man. It says that he's smelling mail that he got from his wife that was sent to him when he was sitting, as part of the invasion, and smelling, that smell of America, that smell of whatever he might have of home. And so what I was finding out a lot about when talking to these people and what it was like for them to be there on the ground at the time was very different from just sitting and reading about it or reporting about it or reading a press release or telling everyone what the government was telling us about what's happening. There was actually a lot of storytelling and a lot of embodiment. And what I mean by embodiment is the act of being somewhere and what it feels like to be in a place. So whether it's the journalist telling the story who's there or the people who are the subjects of the photography or of the journalism or of the story. And so as a result of this, what I'm working on right now is, as I said, theoretical framework. So I'm calling this at this point kind of a working title of what I'm calling embodied evidence-based journalism, which is what I try to do myself as speaking as an individual, not speaking on behalf of UK Column, but as a journalist and an editor myself, that I believe that there's a real need in this time and place where we are right now for experiencing things on the ground, but also basing it in evidence and then comparing and contrasting, right? So the official story might be one thing, but when we actually look at what's happening and we are in the place and experiencing what that's like, it might be something totally different or it might not. So I'm going to go through some things here about what this means academically and in the real world and kind of where I am with things. So it was interesting because I Googled myself yesterday, and I haven't done that in a while. And that was ever since Google started this AI thing where you don't get the top results at the first, you get like all this description about telling you about something. So one of the things that I was known for, without going into detail, was the concept of what was called emotional information retrieval at the time. And this is one of the things that I was known for going into academia, and one of the things that I got promoted for was this idea of retrieval by emotion. And what I mean by retrieval doesn't necessarily mean typing things into Google or into ChatGPT and getting an answer. What it means is, like, what does it mean to experience music, what it means to experience photographs or any kind of documents or any kind of information that we live with in the world. This didn't translate very well. That was actually, I have a Mac, and so this didn't translate well into PowerPoint. But basically, this is from one of my academic heroines. Her name is Professor Marcia Bates from UCLA. And one of the things that she talked about in the idea of information seeking was that what we do when we turn in terms of understanding information and in living through the world, experiencing information, is that information is organized, but about perhaps possibly theoretically 80% of what we understand about information and what we get from the world is just from awareness. It's not from sitting down and typing into Google. It's not from an app. It's not from a website. It's not from going to the library. It's from just living in the world. So that goes to the idea of embodiment and what we learn just by going around and existing and walking around and going about our day. And this is what I've really been interested in, is how information, but living in the world and having this experience, what does that actually mean for us as information consumers? So if we go back to 9/11, this was a famous photo. It created a lot of controversy at the time. We can see this was on 9/11 itself. We can see the Twin Towers burning in the background. We can also see these people having a conversation. It was a group of young people. And this was actually a banned photo at the time because they were afraid that it looked like these people didn't actually care what was happening. If you can imagine people even believing that they didn't care that their city was burning in the background, this was banned. And because they thought, well, these people don't care. And that was, the media was then trying to influence the fear campaign, that they were trying to say, well, we can't sit down and have a conversation about what just happened to our city. It just looks like they're just having a nice day out. So the media was banning this, and a lot of reviews of what happened in 9/11, we don't see this photo anymore unless we see it as a criticism of what people were actually going through. Hurricane Katrina. So I went to New Orleans the year after Hurricane Katrina happened. And this was at the time I was actually finishing up my PhD in photojournalism. So I interviewed a lot of the photographers who covered Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which followed in 2005. And then in 2006, I was in New Orleans for a conference. And so this is not my photo, but I took a lot of photos of these houses where we saw spray painted the number of bodies they found, how many people were found, how many pets were found. A lot of the photographers that were there at the time that were covering the story were sailing around in boats trying to rescue people from the tops of the houses. The thousands of people stranded in the Superdome, the thousands of people stranded in the convention center, and I was in those places. And I can tell you for a fact that what you saw in the news and what the media told you and what the government was telling us, what was going on at the time, was totally different from what actually happened on the ground. And so here we have this developing idea of, well, here's what we're being told, here's what's happening, and George W. Bush saying, Brown, you're doing a heck of a job, and we're talking about the FEMA people, right? And but actually, no, people were dying. I was living in Dallas at the time. It was the closest major city to what was happening. People were coming to Dallas. I saw them getting off the buses from New Orleans. People who had no clothing, they had nothing for their babies, they had no food. I was contributing things to them directly to the hotels. I saw these people getting off the buses. And so what we were being told by the official sources or the mainstream media was very different from what was actually happening on the ground. So once again, comparing what are we being told, what's actually happening. So going into a little bit of the academic background of all this, I call him my academic grandfather, Patrick Wilson. He was my supervisor's supervisor. And he wrote this book called Secondhand Knowledge, which is about the idea of cognitive authority. So the idea of authoritative sources in information, and of course in journalism, follows. Why is this considered an authoritative source? Is it because he is the expert? Is it because he is the GP and he's telling us what's best for us? Is it because it's the BBC? I hope not. So what is it that we're actually getting our sources from, and why do you believe the source is reliable? And that therefore the experts are the ones that we're supposed to listen to. So who is considered an expert in the media? Is it Mariana Spring herself? This is a quote from her introduction to her book, which I did review on UK Column a while ago. I'm huddled in my bedroom with 5 phones featuring fake characters. So here's Mariana being fake news herself. I created to enter subjective social media worlds and then flown with those same phones to Washington and Milwaukee to match up what these characters were seeing online to the experiences of real people. So we have Mariana. She's being fake herself, right? But she is the authoritative source because she is the BBC, and she was a ball girl at Wimbledon and gave flowers to the Queen years ago. So does that make her authoritative? Well, what do you think? This was CNN, fake news. Remember Donald Trump saying CNN is fake news back in 2015? This was, you could go watch this on YouTube. This was during Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War, 1990. And you could actually see this guy, Charles Jaco, who's terrified me at the time because I was watching these gas masks and everything. You can actually see they had a fake set with plastic palm trees. And you can actually watch the footage of when they were on and off camera. But there was another camera rolling in the background. You can see that it was all staged, even though it was there to terrify us. More recently, a horror warning issued as deadly virus could be lurking in UK homes. Be terrified. So what's is really funny about this, I put this on Facebook because you can see the woman, oh, I'm so sick, but she's got full makeup on. She looks better than I do right now. And she's like, oh, I'm so sick, because she's an actress, all crisis actors, right, telling us to be afraid. So because of all this, one of the most cited pieces of academic research that I did at the time was about what I called affective authority. So the type of authority that we create because someone else has the same illness that we have, or someone else has a similar lived experience, which is different from what a GP would tell us. And I did this looking at what women were saying about endometriosis because that's a disease that I've lived with for most of my life. And the idea of affective authority became really popular. So we see things like vaccine injury groups now, right? People that were vaccine injured have a very different experience to what it's like to live with the effects of the mRNA injections or whatever, compared to what a GP might tell us, or what the UK HSA tells us, saying, oh, it's safe and effective still, really? Okay. So, got to bring up the Epstein files. So now I'm going to go into the space part of my talk. So here's the aliens worrying about what Trump is going to release about them later this year. So hopefully they'll get off better than Epstein did, but we'll see what happens. So, does that look real to you? Yeah, this is from the official Apollo videos. The mannequin's not even touching the vehicle, but it's actually part of the NASA files, saying this is what happened on the moon. Capricorn 1. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend it. You can see it for free on YouTube. This was what it might possibly be like to stage what it'd be like to go to Mars. So I like the tinfoil all over it's kind of ironic, right? A bunch of tinfoil hatters talking about Mars, covered in the spaceship being covered in tinfoil. So, what does that actually mean for us? But on a very serious note, I want to talk about the work I've been doing and UK Column has been doing for several years on the For Nothing residential school case, which has been going on since David Scott started this back in 2021, 22, and is still continuing to this day, which has, of course, been passed on to me and to Brian Garish. And this has become something that UK Column has been doing for several years, and I want to talk about this as sort of a case study to kind of explain what I'm trying to do with this idea of embodied, evidence-based journalism. And so this is on our website. All of the reporting that we've been doing for the past few years is available on this one part of our website. And this is my article. This was the first thing I ever contributed to UK Column, and it was actually the work that I was doing as a background researcher for David Scott starting in 2023. And this was a result of the work that I did going to visit archives and libraries, both in the Glasgow Mitchell Library, Glasgow City Archives, National Library of Scotland, the National Records of Scotland. So this was all the historical background work that I was doing, which was summarized in this piece, which then was a piece of essentially journalism and reporting, but also academic-focused research. But it then went into me putting into a submission to Scottish Parliament for the petition that has been in place going on for years now, trying to get justice for the Fernethy survivors, which eventually made it to a floor debate, partially based on my evidence, saying that this was not just because of the way everything was set up and what happened from there, and everything that's happened to the women and everything that happened at the time. So this is all about putting together what I call triangulation, which is coming from academic research, which means that you get different pieces and different types of evidence to put together to answer research questions about what's actually happening. And so this is an example of that. So one of the things that was used in this article is this is a piece of paper from 6th of June, 1945, talking about the scheme of residential education run by Glasgow Education Authority back then. So the scheme of residential education was something, as I found out after spending a very long time looking at historical records, was set up post-war, and they were using buildings that were usually used as evacuation shelters or housing units at the time, and they had all these places left after the war. What are they going to do with them? Well, they decided to lock up kids for a few weeks or a few months or a few years at a time, because why not? They decided it would be good for the children. And so these were always run under the Glasgow Corporation's Education Committee, followed by Strathclyde Regional Council later. And one of the questions that David Scott and I had was, were these actually run by Education Committee? And yes, we did find that this was an important piece of evidence, because the Scottish government has been saying for years, oh no, it was a holiday camp. It was a place for respite care for convalescent girls starting as young as age 5 who were actually abused in every way possible when they were there. So what happened was we went through and found this evidence, or I found this evidence to show that Hillfoot Residential School, which was the precursor to Fernethy. So once they bought the Fernethy building, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, way up in remote Angus, Hillfoot was the precursor to Fernethy, which then had a number that was then linked to say this was part of the Glasgow Education Authority. Because it was run by the Education Authority, that meant that they were taken out of the custody of their parents and put into the care of the state. And therefore, they were responsible for everything that happened to the girls when they were there. And the whole time they were trying to deny, oh, well, it doesn't count because they were just there for a holiday. Well, no, actually, they were unenrolled from their Glasgow primary school, placed into school at Fernethy or Hillfoot before that. And then anything that happened to them meant that the state, Glasgow, was responsible for what happened. So this was a very important piece of information. It doesn't seem like a big deal because it's just a piece of yellow paper I found in an archive, but actually it was the basis for everything in their case. But so that was the sort of the archival work. I actually drove up to Fernethy in late 2023. The building, you can't access it. This is as far as I could get in the car. You wouldn't know it was there because it's a very creepy setting in the middle of absolutely nowhere in remote Angus outside of Dundee and Perth. So this is as far as I could get at the car. The gates are locked, so if you want, you have to walk. You can get up there and you have to walk for at least 20 minutes through foresty areas and places where you feel like scary things are going to happen. And then Fernethy is hidden in a valley between some foresty land. And you realize once you're there, it's the absolutely perfect place for very bad things to happen, which did happen to little girls under the care of the establishment and men high up in the Scottish government and potentially Jimmy Savile and all kinds of things that we really don't know yet. But the point here is that this was another piece of my journalism, was to go up there myself and actually experience what it was like to be there around the building, which is very different from looking at the archives, very different from what the BBC or the Scottish Express will tell you what actually happened. So again, putting together parts of the picture. So by the time this all happened, so I don't know if you haven't seen my reporting on this in the column, one of the last surviving teacher from Fernethy that we believe to be alive, was convicted of several counts of cruel and unnatural treatment of the children at the time. She was not convicted. She was found to be not proven of the sexual abuse. But what was interesting about this, and this is where we get into looking at the system itself and the system of abuse, so establishment abuse, state-sponsored abuse on a very wide scale around the country. But they found this one woman, and over you see the headlines from the mainstream sources saying, oh, she was evil, she was sadistic, right? So here's the Glasgow Live Daily Record, evil teacher. It's all about the one evil woman. Daily Record, evil teacher. She didn't get sent to jail. She got 3 years probation. She's 77 years old. She wasn't sent to prison, and so the women were absolutely furious, understandably, about the fact that nothing actually happened to her. The BBC, of course, retired teacher sentenced for abusing girls at residential school. So again, we're ignoring the fact that there is this system of abuse that's happening. It's not just one woman. There's thousands of girls that were sent there from the age of 5, abused in every way possible. And then, we also see the narrative with the so-called Asian grooming games or Pakistani grooming games, ignoring the fact that people in this country who are British nationals are just as guilty, if not more guilty, than what we're calling the Asian games, because this is happening. This is a systemic approach to abusing little girls and little children around the country. So again, looking at what the mainstream is telling us is saying, oh well, here's what happened. Here was the sentencing. The judge, Lord Colbeck, he said, well, this woman was evil, and we're going to put her on probation, house arrest for a year. But actually, it's a way to cover up what's actually happening. So when we go into that deeper level of embodied journalism and actually looking at evidence and putting together multiple pieces of evidence, including archival research, including talking to the women who were there, looking at what's happening in the government at the government level and within the City of Glasgow Council, we have a lot of sources put together to actually uncover what's happening, which you will not find by taking the mainstream approach, which is to just repeat back whatever you heard by sending some 22-year-old to sit in court for 10 minutes, which is who I was sitting next to when I was sitting in the press box when I was actually attending the court and the sentencing hearing for Finethi. So again, we see this over and over again, Sky News. But then developing the personal relationships with the women, which I learned how to do to build rapport over doing 20 years of qualitative research. These were 2 of the leaders of the Finethi survivor group. So that's Lynn Sharon and Sharon Cruden. And that was us having dinner the night before we found out about the sentencing. So we got bad news about the sentencing the next day, but at least we had a nice dinner the evening before when I came up to Glasgow. So again, creating friendships, creating relationships, which is really what I believe embodied evidence-based journalism is about. So we can go to places, we can cover events, we can see what's happening, we can look at official sources, we can look at UN policy documents, which I do because you don't have to. That's kind of my tagline at UK Column. I do it so you don't have to. But really looking at what happens at a local level and how the globalist agenda plays out locally is really important so that we can understand how the system works from the very bottom, from those of us who actually live in the world, all the way up to whoever it is at the top that's controlling whatever happens to us. So this is where I think my working model can hopefully come into play. So I guess just to close here, British brain rot. First look at Prince Andrew inside his jail cell after being arrested on his 66th birthday. So with that, I just want to close and say, I guess, this doesn't necessarily take the perspective of UK Column as an organization. This is just my working view of what needs to happen. Not everybody shares this view. Not everybody does things this way. But I do believe that if we are going to have a truly alternative model for looking at how to cover what's happening in the world and to get people to understand it, and then to eventually get them to take action and to do something, whatever. I can't grow food. I don't understand protozoa. I'm not a doctor, but I can talk about the media. So my idea here is that, I can report, I can research, I can talk about things, I can go to events, I can do this stuff, I can write, I can edit. We all need to find out what we can do, and I hope that maybe today will inspire all of you to figure out what it is that you can do personally to make a difference in fighting the agenda that people are trying to place against us. So thanks very much.
Okay, any questions?
Very good, thank you. So I was just thinking what you were talking about our embodied experience of information, and I was thinking about historic propaganda, say like World War I, World War II, is very obvious looking back now. Posters and everything. We want you and everything.
Yeah.
But now we're in a highly digital age, and psychological operations. There's so much more sophisticated, harder to see sometimes, and as we as human beings, like imagery and symbolism is very emotive and it stirs a lot, and it
Yeah.
stir things on a subconscious level without us realizing, when Trump was shot in the ear and then that picture was taken and going, fight, 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 that probably swung a major shift in people's perception.
It got MAGA really invigorated. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my question on
Yeah.
that is, in your opinion, in your experience, what does embodied practice for everyday people look like for critical thinking, discernment, and how we can be more resilient when all of these things are coming at us?
Well, I think it's something that's getting lost, right? Because we're so susceptible to whatever's put in front of us. So if we're on social media, or if we're on, if we actually look back as historically, but also currently, it gets even more complicated because that, I hope, is AI. Well, I don't know. I don't care what happens to Prince Andrew, but let's assume that is AI. And so it's hard to say because we've got deepfakes, we've got AI, we've got, was that really Princess Kate? We don't really know anymore. And so this gets more and more complicated. And it gets more and more difficult because there's so much information coming at us all the time, which is why I see my background as an information scientist integral to what we do now with journalism, because it is all information overload. And the information flow and how systems flow and how things are put out us at the 24-hour news cycle and the 24-hour Instagram, whatever, that we really have to be careful. And I think it's something that we're losing because it's so easy for our brains to get overwhelmed and be like, okay, that's what we're being told. The Epstein files are another example of that because we've got millions of emails. They're completely unorganized. It's like, here's a huge data dump. What do we do with this? So we're just going to be looking at, okay, well, here's what they're cherry picking to say, well, we're going to look at this, we're going to look at that, but never mind the fact that this other stuff is going on underneath if you actually do the analysis, because it's way too much for any one person to uncover. It's not organized. There's no way to access it in a useful way. It's the same with the inquiry data, the Scottish COVID inquiry data, the child abuse inquiry data. There's transcripts and transcripts of stuff out there, which we talked about last year at the COVID conference. But how do we make sense of all that information? It's by design, I believe, for us to not be able to discern and make those decisions that we should be able to make because they're not allowing us to do it by designing it this way. And so I see it as my job as a journalist to help understand and unpack all that and help us make sense of what's actually behind it.
Just a question about how you make editorial decisions, because when you mentioned the Epstein case there's so much information, and a source isn't really a source anymore. A source is, a source isn't enough to just publish a story with. You need to go and verify that, report that with another source, report it with another source, because there's just so much stuff, you can't rely on anything, there's stuff that's been manufactured and so forth. At which point, you get demands to get a story out there, the internet is incessant, and people want to consume things. How do you make a decision about going with a story, what's enough validation?
So, because I'm the editor for written content, I can take a little bit more time, right? Because I can look at, have they provided links to a story? What are those links? What have they chosen? And then if I don't believe that they're good sources, I can always go back to the author and say, what are you doing? Why are you linking to this? But I think, what is easy to fall into with everything going on, there's all the geopolitical issues, there's Iran, there's Palestine, there's Ukraine, there's all this. It's easy, I think, for some people to want to share their opinion, which, in my opinion, as the editor for written content, I will put that as a comment piece or a blog post. For me, that's not reporting, that's not news, that's what I think. You can't necessarily say for sure, why did Trump call Putin? We don't know. Only Trump knows. Trump probably doesn't even know, actually. But, we can't get on and say, well, Trump did this or because Putin thought this thing, and then Jelani did this other thing, because we do a lot of stuff on Syria. I don't really necessarily personally believe that is journalism. That is opinion, that is proclamation, that is, and there's a lot of that in alternative media, and be careful of that because you get the people that decide to start the YouTube channel or do the thing or create the TikTok. It's just their opinion. It's not necessarily based in fact. It's certainly not based in embodiment. That's why I will never be seen publicly to comment on the Middle East, because I have no idea. That is completely outside of my culture and my realm of understanding. So I'm not going to get in front of any camera and say that I believe that this is happening or that is happening, because it's not based in embodiment. It's not based in factual information. It's just based on me maybe looking at some other sources and getting emotional about what I'm being told because I don't like the fact that there's a genocide going on, for example, which can also get you canceled for saying that by some people in these days. So I think we really have to be careful in alternative media, because the problem is that it's so easy to go sensationalist because you want the clicks or you want the views or you want the retweets without actually looking at what you're sharing, and then we lose the integrity because we're just trying to get the algorithm to make us popular. Which, Brian Garish always says, well, if you're getting canceled, if the algorithm is not working for you, you're getting taken off, that means that you're making a difference, because it means the establishment is getting scared. You're getting too close to the truth. So if you get some of these people that are getting reshared all over the place, and, oh, look at this latest person saying this thing, well, they're probably not evidence-based, they're probably not embodied, and they're probably just putting something out there because they want the views. They're not actually trying to get to the real story. The closer we get to the real story, the further away we get from getting the millions of subscribers and members that we would love to have, because we do have to pay our bills as well, unfortunately. But I think that's one thing that we have to be aware of as well.
Okay, well, I think probably time for a break now, and we'll break until 2:30. I'd like to thank Diane ever so much for a really fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I really understand what you mean about actually going to a place, and we take in so much information from just being in that place, and then you can say, well, could I imagine this actually happening in this place? And you can say yes or no. And your gut feeling is you're looking at the world all the time, you're analysing the world all the time subconsciously. And if you can take in that information, I think it gives you a much better judgment about what's true and what's not true.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.